Back on the Chad Hasty Show, News Talk 790 KFYO. Joining me now, GOP political strategist and co-founder of MustReadTexas.com, Matt Mackowiak. Matt, good morning. How's it going?
Doing great, Chad. How about you?
Doing all right. Thanks for coming on the program today. Let's take a look first at the midterm elections. A little bit of news over the weekend. That polling data looking good for Republicans overall in the midterms. How, when looking at the midterms, obviously Republicans aiming to take back the Senate. There's been questions about whether that's going to happen or not. Right now, it's leaning towards yes. How confident are you that that's going to happen? And how many seats do you think Republicans will be able to pick up?
Well, it's hard to be precise on the exact number that they're going to end up with, just because you've really still got 9 or 10 seats that are really in play, and you also are going to have Louisiana and Georgia go to runoffs. You know, Louisiana's going to go to a runoff in December, and Georgia's going to go to a runoff on January 6th. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be kind of a stop and start anticlimactic feel to the November 4th result in the Senate. You also have the potential for Alaska with all the rural votes to not just be delayed, but I mean they could be delayed a day or two, or even a couple of weeks, perhaps, if it's a very, very close margin. So I know that's not perhaps great news for those of us who want to kind of get the news right away, but if you just step back, Chad, and look at the map, I mean, you know, Joni Ernst has been ahead in almost every poll for the last month in Iowa. She has a very durable lead. We are ahead in Arkansas. I don't have any concerns there. I do think we're going to win on Alaska. And so, you know, to me, and I think we're going to win Louisiana. So if you do that, those 4 plus the 3 that are already done, you've won 7 seats. But you presume that you don't lose Kansas or Kentucky, which I think we won't. You know, that puts you at 7. That puts you, at 52 seats, I think, right? Because you need 6 to get to 51. So the one I think that a lot of people are going to be watching is going to be North Carolina. For some reason that is just, a mystery to me, Kay Hagan has had a fairly durable 2 or 3 point lead throughout the last month. And it's not entirely clear why. You do have a libertarian who's polling at 7%. There's no way in hell he'll end up that high with no organization getting out his vote. Libertarian and third-party candidates always poll higher than they end up in terms of the actual performance. So that's the one I'm going to be watching. If that's an early win on election night, or it's really, really, really close, I think that's a very positive sign for Republicans that we're going to win 7 or 8 seats.
Visiting with Matt Mackowiak. Taking a look at one of the governor's races up there, Scott Walker. This has implications for 2016. If he loses re-election in Wisconsin, does that put 2016 out of reach for him?
It does, and I think we just got to be honest about that. I mean, I don't know how you run if you just lost a battleground state in the heartland. I just don't know how you do it. That said, I mean, Scott Walker has a great record in that state. He's really turned that state around. The unemployment rate's down significantly. He's created hundreds of thousands of new jobs on his watch. He has a pro-union, self-funding female candidate who's, put a decent amount of money into this race, and it is very, very competitive. The takeaway on Scott Walker is, look, that is a very, very competitive state, and you don't win by large margins in Wisconsin, no matter what party you're in. I think he's probably going to win 52-48 or 51-49. And I think that, it'll be a very interesting race to watch, and you're exactly right. It does have very significant 2016 implications.
Speaking of 2016, Jeb Bush making news over the weekend. George P. Bush, his son, saying that his dad is, moving forward on the prospect of running in 2016. Bush seems to be a very polarizing candidate out there, a potential candidate, not just for Democrats, but for Republicans. Either you have the camp of Republicans, at least those who are paying attention this early on. You either love Jeb Bush, you think Jeb Bush is great, or you're not looking forward to Jeb Bush getting in this race. Where does Jeb Bush fall along these lines as far as his chances with the Republicans in 2016?
Well, I'd start by saying I watched that George P. Bush interview on ABC's This Week, and I thought that the breathless reporting that he was, signaling that his dad is, quote, more likely than not to run was a little bit overdone. I don't believe Jeb has made a decision. There was a New York Times story this morning by Peter Baker, saying, that the Bush network is ready to hop into action quickly. If Jeb decides to run, but that no one has been told, keep your powder dry. No donors, no staff, no one's been promised anything. That's how the New York Times reported it this morning. And so, that's definitely not what's happening with a lot of the other presidentials. A lot of them are making those kinds of promises because they're more certain to be running. So I think Jeb's probably right at 50-50 right now. In terms of your question, he has some challenges with the base on immigration, on Common Core. He knows that. But he also, I think, has a record as governor that is very, very, very strong. People forget this because he left the governor's office in January of 2003, but he has a very conservative record. He was one of the most conservative, reform-minded governors we had. Fred Barnes did a fantastic profile of Jeb Bush in the Weekly Standard several years back. I would encourage everyone listening to go find that article and read it because you might look at Jeb Bush in a whole new way.
What about the Bush last name? Do you think that's a big hint? I mean, look, Republicans haven't been out there embracing George W. yet. Do you think that the Bush name hurts them?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing. If you presume Hillary is the nominee on the Democratic side, my guess is the Bush name doesn't hurt you quite as much because you're going to have a little bit of a dynasty thing on both sides. Now, if your question is, does the name hurt you in a Republican primary? Generally, it may, certainly among, hardcore conservatives. But, look, Jeb's not going to run to be the most conservative candidate in the field. He's going to run to be the mainstream establishment front runner who can beat Hillary. That I think is where he'll be. And look, I think if he runs, I think you almost cannot overstate how strong the financial support will be for him. Yeah. And that's not just Bush Network. That's Florida. He has strong support in New York among, many of the wealthiest, most successful businessmen in New York. So, he's one of the candidates that can get in the latest because he can go from 0 to 60 faster than just about anybody else. What's going to be interesting to me is on that establishment side, if you look at Romney, if you look at, Paul Ryan, if you look at Chris Christie, they're all going to be vying for that same establishment support. It'd be interesting to see if Christie gets in first to try to lock some of that support up and get ahead of Jeb Bush. I think that's something to watch.
Let's, Matt, we've got a question for you on the phones. Let's go to the phones and get HR. HR, you're on with Matt Mackowiak.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. I was going to ask you this question, Chad, but I guess I'll go ahead and ask Matt. Now, Chad always coming in with stories on Houston and some of the liberal policies, Dallas, Austin, some of our bigger cities in Texas. My question is it really going to be difficult for them to try to turn Texas into a democratic type of state with all of these major cities with these liberal policies? And I'll hang up and listen, but I'm really concerned about Texas with all these states, sales are going towards the Democratic Party, and I'll hang up and listen.
All right, thanks, HR.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Keep a couple things in mind, right? I mean, number one, you have these urban areas that are, heavily Democratic in Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio to some extent. So the urban areas are Democratic, but it's the suburban counties that are Republican. I mean, some of the strongest Republican counties in the state are counties like Denton and Collin in Dallas and Montgomery in Houston and the areas around San Antonio and even Williamson County around Austin. Those are all very, very conservative counties. And so, look, I think we're going to learn a lot from this Wendy Davis debacle. If it's the last two polls that showed her down, you had two polls last week, two and only two independent polls last week, and they both had her down 16 points. I know that the Davis campaign was, losing it over the Texas Tribune poll and their methodology. But so we'll see where she ends up. I think she's going to end up right about where Bill White was at 42.4%, maybe slightly ahead, slightly behind that number. But, yeah, I mean, look, do I take Battleground Texas seriously? I do. I think they're doing things in a more targeted and significant way than any effort we've seen in the history of the state. And if they're given, 4, 6, 8 years to build up, there's a chance they can make this a purple state in 10, 12, 14 years. That does concern me. On the other hand, though, look, the economic model in Texas is working. I mean, Texas is the strongest economy of any state by far. particularly if you look over the last 10 years in terms of economic growth and job creation. So it's very hard for Democrats to make the argument Texas is failing under Republican policies because the numbers just don't allow you to make that argument.
Yeah, I think if you're battleground Texas, and then they've put this out before, you're not only looking at statewide races, you're looking at local races, and that's how you get in. You start affecting school boards, and you start affecting city councils, and it takes a while for it to get out statewide, but that's how change starts to happen. I think battleground Texas are smart enough to know that. Yeah,
that's right. And there was a lot of concern on the Republican side in 2008 when Dallas County went heavily Democratic, for example, at the county levels, some of the judicial races, et cetera. Obviously, look, if you look at, Austin's, certainly, Dallas and Houston, those cities have Democratic mayors. And certainly in Houston, you have you have a Democratic, fairly liberal mayor. So you do tend to see these Democratic mayors because, again, in these urban centers, you're talking about Democratic, constituencies. But if you go out in the suburbs, it's very, very different. And so, look, Abbott's going to win by double digits. I predict every statewide Republican's going to win by double digits this year. That's going to be a real downer for battleground Texas and their donors who are expecting Wendy Davis to make this thing competitive and hoping some of these other candidates would do well also.
Yeah, Matt Mackowiak, also co-sponsor or co-founder of mustreadtexas.com. Matt, tell folks what they can find this morning on your website, mustreadtexas.com.
Yeah, my Democratic counterpart, columnist at the Austin American Statesman, Jason Stanford, and I have our takes on Wendy Davis in the paper this morning. We'll post both those links here shortly. Obviously, be following all the news and all the races at mustreadtexas.com.
All right, Matt Mackowiak, as always, thank you for your time.
Have a great week. Thanks.
You too. That's Matt Mackowiak. Follow him on Twitter at Matt Mackowiak.